was only 12 years old when this happened. I was downstairs in my room, just minding my own business like anyone else on the planet. It was late, around midnight. I remember lying down on my bed trying to fall asleep. I used to get these nightmares frequently, so it was hard for me to fall asleep a lot of nights. My parents' room was on the floor above me, almost directly above my room. I heard some loud barging-like noises coming from the general direction of my parents' room, and I thought that maybe they were getting down and dirty or something. So I put some headphones on and I tried to block it out. Before long, I took one side of the earpieces out of my ear in hopes that they were done smashing. It was quiet, so I thought we were in good shape and I was free to try to sleep again. I laid there for a few minutes, headphoneless this time. It couldn't have been more than 10 minutes later that I heard the window on the upstairs living room being bashed open. I sat up and I darted for my bedroom to lock it like a scared deer. I knew there was something wrong and that we might be in some serious trouble. All the thoughts I had about my parents fornicating upstairs might not have even been what was actually happening. But I really didn't care about that anymore though. I cared about the stranger in my house. I was praying my dad would hear the commotion and wake up and that this would all be over soon. I started screaming for my parents, and then I heard some footsteps walking slowly, coming from upstairs. It sounded like whoever it was wearing boots. I was hoping it was my dad, but I knew it wasn't. I can still imagine every time the heel of his foot hit the tile of our kitchen floor. Every second that passed by, I thought that at any minute he was going to come for me. I barely had a means of protection, so I hid in my closet. Suddenly, the man stopped. He must have been standing still, probably trying to figure out his next move. It was at this point I realized I should probably stop screaming because it was just going to alert him of my position. For those of you wondering why my parents didn't wake up, it was a Saturday night and my parents were heavy drinkers. They were out cold. So now, here I am alone downstairs with a random man knowing exactly where I'm at, presumably. I was absolutely positive that I was going to be a victim of murder or child trafficking, just like those scary slasher movies. I was unbelievably terrified. Also because both of my parents' vehicles were in the driveway. He knew there were people home. Like who breaks into someone's house when they know the homeowner is home? It had to be something personal, or at the very least, he had to be armed with a gun or a knife. Moments later, I heard the doorknob to the basement turn and the creaking of the door. Every step he took down those stairs felt like a slow, excruciating death. I was screaming like I never had before. Every second I screamed louder and louder, until eventually my dad started screaming for me by saying my name. The man was all the way downstairs approaching my door by the time my dad made it to us, and he shot the creepy man in the back, probably 5 times. He fell to the ground, and my dad ran and grabbed me from my room, telling me to keep my eyes closed as we exited this scene. Of course, we called the police, and the man was pronounced dead. My dad and I had to answer a lot of questions that night, but thankfully, we have the stand your ground law in our state, and so my father didn't get in any trouble for the murder. Shouldn't even call it a murder. He was protecting his family. He was a homeless man who had been on and off drugs his whole life with a very lengthy criminal past. Nobody misses him to this day. This happened many years ago when I was a kid, around the ages of 9 or 10, but I still remember every detail of the story, as it was one of the scariest nights of my life. My family lived in the very rural South, and I was at my grandma's house spending the night because my parents had to go somewhere and wouldn't be back until morning. My grandpa was on night shift, so it was just me and my grandma there by ourselves. By the time I was dropped off by my parents, it was already getting late into the night, but me and my grandma decided we wanted to watch TV. By the time 10 p.m. started to roll around, we were already dozing off in the living room to an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, when we heard a loud crash and glass shattering from the basement. My grandma was shocked and froze for a moment before running as fast as she could to the kitchen where the basement door was, with me following behind. To our horror, the door was unlocked. My grandma ran to get the first thing she could find small enough to fit in the keyhole and turn the lock, because the original key was lost. By the time she locked the door, we could hear heavy footsteps stomping up the wooden basement steps, and when they reached the top, we could hear the doorknob start to turn back and forth. My grandma grabbed my hand and dragged me to her room and grabbed her old .22 revolver she got from her dad. She took us back to the living room, where she called my dad to tell him the situation. While she was on the phone, we could hear walking and someone rummaging around the stuff in the basement, which my grandparents used as a storage room. My dad told my grandma to keep the gun close by, and while waiting, we eventually heard the noises in the basement stop, though she decided not to call the cops, because it would take too long for them to get there, and there was most likely nothing they could do anyways. A few hours passed by, and my dad finally showed up and got his gun and flashlight, and looked around the house and basement. The basement's window was broken from the outside, and there were signs of someone being in the basement, with bags of stuff dumped on the floor and things strung out all over the place. My dad stayed with me and my grandma until my grandpa got home from work. After that, my dad took me back home and my grandparents just stayed at their house with a gun by their side all night. I'm pretty sure they never ended up calling the police. Nothing else happened to my knowledge. I know this probably isn't as crazy as other home invasion stories, because I never even saw the intruder. But just knowing that we were mere seconds away from the intruder meeting us face to face still gives me chills to this day. When I was a small child, my family and I lived in a really small town, which I hated for most of my younger years, but I also learned to love it eventually as I got older. I hated the fact that we were 15 minutes away from any store at all, and my close-knit family, which I've always loved dearly, were extremely poor. I wasn't allowed to hang out with friends much, and I was homeschooled. Luckily, I had one younger brother that was similar in age. Otherwise, I probably would have went insane. We were very desocialized and sheltered from the world 95% of my upbringing. My dad worked like 15 hours a day, and my mom was a stay-at-home mother who looked after us boys all day. Just imagine a house in rural Mississippi with 10 acres, and the house is completely surrounded by a cornfield. All of our neighbors were a 2-minute drive away, which wasn't crazy to me growing up, but as I ventured into the city life as I got older, I really started to realize how sheltered I was as a kid. Anyways, off topic. Since I lived in the country, it would get very dark outside at night. No street lights around or anything like that. Well, one night, I kind of snuck out of the house when everyone was sleeping. I wasn't up to anything bad, truly, but I still consider it sneaking out, since I wasn't supposed to be outside alone at that time of night, especially without alerting my parents. Sometimes I would bring a lantern with me and read a book in the backyard, under a tree, while swinging on the hammock. Or other times I would simply sit on the porch when I was that bored. I was a weird kid, I guess. I remember the last time I did this, it was a close call. As soon as I walked outside, I thought I heard someone talking. I knew for a fact it wasn't my brother or my parents, so it left me confused. Thinking back now, I have no idea why I wasn't scared. I think most normal people would be on edge with something like that, especially a kid my age. Maybe it was my childlike innocence that thought nothing bad could happen to me. Although it's hard to remember exactly how I felt. I can imagine I must have been confused but also intrigued because I followed the voice. It sounded like an angry man. Maybe he was on the phone with somebody. But what was he doing at my house? I hid behind a tree and I saw him, just barely. I could see the dark shadow silhouette of his body moving with the wind. He was walking towards me at an angle, and I don't think he had seen me yet. I don't know why, but it wasn't until this moment that I started to feel scared. Something inside of me realized I may be in danger. That's when I booked it back where I came from and right up the front door. I looked behind me and there he was, running at me. Luckily, I got inside and I locked the door before he could get to me. But now, he was standing on our porch, banging on the door. He was screaming to let him in and that he was going to get me regardless. I ran to my dad's room and he grabbed a rifle and threatened him through the door, but not opening it yet. The man fell silent for a second when he heard my father's threats. All of a sudden, you could hear him running away and down the wooden steps. That was the last we ever heard from him. I don't think my father called the police because I think he thought the situation was over for good and that he wouldn't be coming back. I always had these dreams of him coming back while my dad was at work during the day or back to that night, but with the scenario ending a lot differently and a lot worse. Thankfully, he never came back in real life that I'm aware of. I'm pretty sure my dad would have killed him if he tried. I guess that's my story of my encounter with the crazy man who tried to kidnap me and break into my house.